A door that should not exist creaked open on its own in a forgotten monastery near the Seine. Behind it, wooden mannequins stood in perfect rows, their faces scraped raw as if someone had tried to erase humanity itself. Rusted surgical tools pointed toward a narrow corridor, and the air smelled of carbolic, fresh, boiling, alive. One mannequin twitched. One heartbeat echoed where none should have been. And then the stairs behind the restorers sealed themselves with warm, living wood. What kind of madness continues its work centuries later, sculpting people into something they were never meant to become? The story begins with a door that should not have existed, a sliver of warped oak splitting the wall of the abandoned monastery crouched near the gray curl of the Seine. For decades the structure had been left to drown in dust and river fog, its cloisters collapsing inward like a creature folding itself in death. Yet on a winter dawn of the year 1794 this particular door stood slightly ajar, as if a breath from within had pushed it open moments before the restorers arrived. No drafts touched the courtyard that morning, yet a soft warmth seeped from the fissure between plank and frame, the kind of warmth that belonged not to human comfort, but to something that heated itself without flame or furnace. The restorers hesitated only long enough for their lanterns to tremble. The trembling was not a quiver of clumsy hands, but a pulse, a faint contraction of light that made the flames bend away from the entrance, as if recoiling from an animal musk too subtle for human nostrils, but unmistakable to fire. They stepped inward, and the monastery swallowed the sound of their boots as if the stones had been waiting for new weight after long hunger. Dust shifted underfoot in oddly symmetrical patterns, not like the disordered scatter left by rodents or the errant sweep of wind, but like the lingering ghost of careful footsteps measured in exact intervals. The corridor ahead thinned into a throat of gloom, and the thin glow of lanterns stretched only a few paces before being devoured. It was not ordinary shadow. It behaved like a viscous substance, thickening as they descended the narrow staircase that coiled downward into the belly of the building. Each step deeper made the air feel less like air and more like the exhalation of something unseen and patient. The lantern flames guttered in synchronized beats, dipping with each downward stride, as though responding to a silent rhythm emanating from beneath the stone. The restorers felt the temperature shift, then shift again, not in steady gradients, but in abrupt pockets, warmth brushing one cheek, icy needles grazing the other, as if they were passing through the layered breaths of multiple unseen presences. The dust on the stair railing was interrupted by long streaks where something had dragged damp fingers recently enough for the residue to remain tacky. The lowest steps quivered faintly under their weight, not from weakness, but from something beneath them shifting its equilibrium. When the final tread disappeared behind them, the staircase tightening into a ceiling of stone above their heads, the darkness swallowed the last trace of surface light. Their lanterns shrank to thin, nervous halos, and instead of illuminating the corridor ahead, they seemed to illuminate only the space immediately around their own bodies, as if the underground permitted only the narrowest glimpse of its interior. It felt less like entering a forgotten cellar and more like crossing the threshold into a throat that had been waiting centuries to taste light again. The warmth emanating from below pulsed once, gently, like a quiet heartbeat acknowledging their arrival. The discovery revealed itself piece by piece, like flesh lifted from bone, with a slowness that felt intentional, as though the underground chambers wished to dictate the pace at which their secrets surfaced. The air thickened as the restorers advanced, and the faint warmth that had drawn them downward now mingled with a dampness that clung to their sleeves like cold sweat. The lantern halos quivered, struggling to penetrate the deeper pockets of shadow, until the gloom thinned just enough to unveil the first line of wooden figures stationed along the chamber walls. They stood rigid, each a silent sentry carved from pale timber, their torsos polished to a smooth curvature that suggested contact with something pliant, something stretched tight across their frames for a purpose far more unsettling than mere artistry. Dust had settled into their grain like aging skin, yet beneath the haze each form retained a disturbing sense of unfinished readiness, as though awaiting the return of hands that had abandoned their labor centuries earlier. Their faces, if such shapes could be called faces, held the most violence. Splintered patches interrupted the smooth wood, harsh gouges marking the places where cheeks, brows, and jaws might once have been imposed. No painter's brush had ever touched these surfaces. Instead, rough scraping had peeled away the thin veneer of simulated humanity, leaving behind a geometry that mirrored the stark anatomy of skulls carved by hands unsteady not from inexperience, but from frenzy. The restorers could not shake the impression that whatever features had adorned the mannequins had not been removed for restoration or correction, but excised in an act of urgent erasure, as if the craftsman feared the likenesses he had created and sought to obliterate them before they could accuse him of something unspeakable. The chamber extended in both directions, but the placement of the figures funneled attention toward a single corridor at the far end. The mannequins stood angled subtly inward, their eyeless heads directed toward that narrow passageway no wider than the length of a coffin. Their bodies, though lifeless, formed a procession that mimicked reverence or dread. The restorers could not tell which emotion the wooden poses intended to convey, only that the alignment felt too deliberate to be accidental. Beneath their feet lay an assortment of rusted surgical saws from the dark days of the Terror, each blade mottled with corrosion, yet still sharp at the edges where teeth remained intact. The tools were oriented toward the same corridor, their handles pointing outward like fingers indicating a path that none of the mannequins had dared to walk. A faint sheen on the metal glimmered in the lantern light, betraying moisture that should not have existed on instruments abandoned for over a century. When one of the restorers knelt to inspect a particularly large saw, the air shifted, carrying upward a scent both sterile and nauseatingly warm, the unmistakable odor of hot carbolic solution. The smell was fresh, scandalously fresh, as though someone had boiled disinfectant in the next room only moments earlier. The restorers exchanged silent glances, though no words left their lips. The underground seemed too attentive, too ready to seize upon any sound not its own. The scent wafted from the corridor ahead, rolling out in faint pulses that mimicked breath exhaled through a heated filter. The corridor itself remained shrouded in a darkness that did not behave like absence of light, but like a substance that resisted illumination. When the lantern beams attempted to pierce it, the glow seemed to recoil, bending away as if encountering a pressure far denser than air. The floor near the corridor mouth bore faint streaks, thin trails of residue that gleamed faintly, as though recently left by something dragged with care rather than haste. The walls, too, carried long vertical marks, indentations resembling the tracks made by wooden frames pressed repeatedly against the stone, the way a body might shift restlessly upon a slab during some obscene procedure. The warmth intensified the closer they moved toward the passage. It radiated not as a blanket of steady heat, but in rhythmic surges, like the pulses of an unseen organ working steadily deeper within the earth. Every object in the chamber, every mannequin, every saw, every grain of dust, seemed oriented toward that source. It felt as if the entire room had been arranged to funnel attention toward the corridor, urging any intruder to step inside. And the scent of carbolic solution, still rising in fresh waves, whispered the terrible possibility that the work once done in these depths had never truly ceased. They pushed deeper, guided not by courage but by the unmistakable pull of a presence that seemed to expand with each step they took, filling the narrow corridor until it felt as though they were walking directly into the lungs of something vast. The warmth that had earlier crept in timid pulses now radiated in steady waves, insinuating itself beneath their skin, loosening the boundary between their bodies and the humid air around them. The corridor widened abruptly, spilling them into a chamber whose proportions were neither symmetrical nor entirely natural. The space felt carved not by tools but by intention, as though it had been shaped to mirror some inner architecture of a mind intent on ritual rather than function. The remnants of a workshop lay scattered in near-perfect stillness, yet nothing about the space suggested craftsmanship in the ordinary sense. Wooden tables dominated the central floor, their surfaces carved with deep grooves that ran in parallel and crisscrossed patterns. The indentations were shaped with such precision that each implied the presence of a body forcibly pressed to match a contour it could never naturally assume. Some grooves were shallow, meant for limbs. Others were curved too sharply for bones to follow without breaking. The tables themselves were stained with a residue neither dust nor dried varnish could explain, a thin veil of something once organic that had hardened into a brittle crust. When one restorer brushed a gloved hand across it, the fragments crumbled into pale flakes that dissolved on the air like the remains of old skin. Above them, hooks dangled from long iron chains that reached down from the ceiling like pendulums trapped in time. They did not sway, even though the warm drafts drifting through the room came in rhythmic waves strong enough to stir loose dust. Each hook carried remnants of a substance resembling ancient wax, translucent in the lantern light with a faint yellow tint. But when one restorer allowed his fingertips to graze a strand, the material resisted with an elasticity that felt disturbingly alive. It was not wax. It had the fibrous rigidity of hardened collagen, the tactile memory of something once warm. Several strands were twisted together, forming cords that looked as though they had once supported significant weight. The hooks themselves were bent slightly upward at their tips, as though straining to hold onto something that had writhed violently before slipping free. The stone walls enclosing the chamber bore the marks of that struggle. Scratches covered nearly every reachable surface, thin lines etched by fingernails or sharper tools, layered over one another so densely that they formed a history written in desperation. The markings varied in depth and direction, some faint and hesitant, others gouged with such force that stone dust still clung loosely around their edges. If one followed the lines closely enough, they revealed overlapping patterns of movement, circles where hands had spun wildly, vertical streaks where bodies had been dragged downward, and arc-shaped scrapes tracing the last arcs of limbs pushing against restraint. The walls read like a palimpsest of final confessions, each rendered in strokes born not of ink but of terror. On the far side of the chamber stood a long bench littered with narrow wooden slats, each shaped like ribs carved from pale timber. Some were smooth, others rough, as though halfway through their formation the creator had abandoned patience for speed. Beneath these slats lay leather straps, stiffened with age, yet still faintly pliant, their buckles rusted but intact. The straps were arranged to mirror the human thorax, looping around an invisible chest as though waiting for a body to anchor them back into purpose. Their placement implied that the workshop had been used not merely to carve but to assemble, to bind disparate materials into shapes that could pass for living forms if viewed from a respectful distance, or in dim torchlight from behind. Every object in the room carried the residue of intention, of ritual, of a grotesque devotion that lingered in the stale air like a whispered vow. The restorers sensed the room had never been meant to produce beauty or utility. It had served instead as an altar for transformation, where bodies and wood blended into something that might have resembled the creator's fevered vision of perfection. The warmth rising from the floor intensified, a slow, steady pulse that made the lantern flames bow in submission. And beneath that warmth lay the faintest tremor, a vibration too regular to be dismissed as shifting stone. It felt like the heartbeat of the workshop itself, steady, expectant, as if waiting for new offerings to take the place of those whose final struggle had been etched into the walls. The corridor ahead tightened as though the stone itself were contracting, guiding them onward with the slow, deliberate pressure of a living organ drawing breath. Each step into its narrowing throat was met by a faint warmth rising from the floor in pulses too regular to be random. The air clung to their skin with the intimacy of damp cloth, and the lantern light traveled reluctantly, pushing against a darkness that thickened in shallow, invisible layers. The hum within the corridor swelled gradually, not a sound but a vibration, the kind felt in bones rather than heard by ears, like a memory of distant machinery continuing its work in defiance of time. The restorers moved forward not because they willed it, but because the corridor seemed to breathe them in, drawing them toward a destination it had long prepared. At the end of the narrowing passage, the space opened abruptly into a chamber domed with stone so heavy it seemed to swallow sound the moment it was born. Even their breathing felt smothered, as if the ceiling hung inches above their faces instead of soaring high into unseen darkness. Yet the room vibrated with a nervous hum, a taut resonance that suggested the stones remembered screams once absorbed into their mass. The vibrations skittered along the floor, rose up the walls, and nested in the lantern flames, causing the light to tremble in small, frightened jerks. The domed ceiling carried no carvings, no mortar lines, no visible architecture, just smooth, uninterrupted stone that gave the unsettling impression of an enormous skull turned hollow and inverted, resting upon the shoulders of the earth. A workbench dominated the center of the chamber. It was made of dark wood warped by heat or time or something more intimate, and atop it lay a half-finished mannequin that differed in every disquieting way from the others the restorers had seen. This one bore a face, and not the scraped-away facsimiles clinging to the earlier figures. Its features were molded in pale wax that still glistened with a tacky sheen, as though the last layer had been poured only minutes before the restorers entered. The wax had not yet settled into final stillness. Minute ripples trembled across the cheeks and brow, catching the lantern light in patterns unsettlingly similar to the twitch of living skin beneath cold sweat. The face lacked eyes, yet the empty sockets gleamed faintly, as though the wax at their edges retained warmth from a touch that had pressed into them recently, too recently for comfort. Beneath the fragile skin of wax, something within the mannequin shifted. It was not a sudden movement, but a subtle internal contraction, the near imperceptible flutter of tissue refusing to accept the silence imposed upon it. The tremor radiated outward, traveling across the wooden torso beneath the waxen mask in a faint wave that returned moments later like an echo orbiting inside a body. It was the unmistakable rhythm of a heartbeat, weak, reluctant, but present. The restorers stepped back instinctively, though the heavy air of the chamber made their retreat feel sluggish, as if they were wading through the remnants of someone else's breath. Beside the mannequin lay tools arranged with ceremonial precision, thin knives whose blades bore neither rust nor dust, shallow bowls marked with rings of congealed residue, and brushes whose bristles were stained a pale yellow that mirrored the color of the waxen face. Some tools were warm to the touch when the restorers hovered their hands near them, radiating a heat that suggested recent use rather than centuries of abandonment. On a narrow shelf above the bench lay thin strips of something that resembled parchment but carried a faint translucence that made them look disturbingly like peeled membrane. The strips curled at the edges as though reacting to the humid air, shrinking away from the lantern light, like nocturnal things rousing unwillingly from sleep. The hum within the chamber deepened. It synchronized with the faint twitch beneath the mannequin's waxen layer, forming a rhythm that suggested the workshop retained not just memory but purpose. The domed ceiling seemed to draw the vibrations upward, magnifying them into a resonant tremor that coursed back into the floor. The restorers could not determine whether the heartbeat originated in the mannequin or the chamber itself, only that the two pulses were aligning, merging into a single cadence. As they watched, the wax at the mannequin's jawline softened slightly, sagging in a way no natural cooling process could explain. It was as though the face were adjusting itself, attempting to settle into an expression it had not yet decided upon. And beneath that shifting mask, the faint tremor persisted, steady, patient, ready to resume a life that had never properly ended. The monastery responded to their presence with a patience that felt deliberate, a slow tightening of its ancient body as though it had finally recognized the intruders and begun the process of enclosing them. At first the changes were subtle enough to dismiss as trickery of light or nerves frayed by stale air, but soon the pattern became undeniable. Doors they had pushed open minutes earlier now stood sealed behind them, the wood fitting into its frames with an unnerving precision that suggested recent craftsmanship rather than centuries of decay. Hinges that should have groaned with rust now shut silently, as if guided by hands that pressed them closed with practiced ease. The hallways themselves seemed to stretch or compress by imperceptible degrees, obscuring familiar landmarks so that the route back felt not merely confusing but actively rewritten. Along the workbenches, tools the restorers had not laid a finger on shifted their orientation. At first a chisel angled slightly to the left. Later a bone saw rolled an inch toward their path. Finally, an entire row of slender knives aligned as though pulled by a shared instinct, their thin blades pointing toward the center of the room, like a congregation turning in unison to face an unexpected visitor. Nothing moved quickly or abruptly. Instead, everything adjusted with the languid certainty of a creature awakening from a long hibernation, testing its surroundings, reacquainting itself with the old shapes of its own habits. The first faint scraping came from behind them, a soft, steady whisper too even to be vermin, too measured to be the building settling. It carried the cadence of deliberate labor, the rhythmic strokes of a craftsman removing thin layers from an uncooperative material. The sound had weight, a moist undertone that suggested the scraping met inconsistent resistance, as though sliding from hard surface to soft without hesitation. It followed them as they moved, pausing only when they turned their lanterns fully toward the corridor, resuming the moment they began to walk again. The scraping grew louder by the dimmest increments, not with urgency, but with inevitability, echoing the methodical patience of someone who knew that time favored their steady hands. The air thickened with the sour smell of heated resin, a scent sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. It rose in waves from unseen vents or cracks, clinging to the humid walls and pooling in shallow hollows of the floor. The odor carried a faint sweetness beneath its acrid surface, a sweetness that felt dangerously familiar, like something organic being distilled into its essential components. The restorers wiped their eyes as the fumes began to irritate them, but the smell only grew denser, mingling with the pulse of warmth radiating from deeper chambers. Lantern flames responded first with agitation, then with surrender, shrinking into fragile threads of light that flickered as though struggling against an invisible pressure. The darkness around them inhaled each wavering glow, drawing the lantern's strength into itself the way lungs draw air. As light diminished, shapes the restorers had not noticed before emerged along the periphery. Mannequins they thought they had walked past earlier now stood closer, their faceless heads angled subtly toward the group. The smooth wooden torsos, once inert shapes in the background, seemed to absorb the dim light and release it in a faint sheen that made them appear less carved than cured. Their proximity tightened the already suffocating air, turning the chamber into a narrow artery pulsing with the suggestion of movement. The scraping sound deepened, acquiring a rasp that hinted at increased pressure, the way a blade bites more eagerly once it has located the grain of its material. The corridor behind them flickered with intermittent illumination as the last defiant lantern flame strained to hold its form. Each flicker revealed brief impressions, a shadow where no object stood, a glint on metal where none had been before, a subtle shift in the position of a table leg that had been motionless hours or centuries earlier. The monastery no longer felt like a structure but a presence, inhaling, contracting, preparing itself with the slow precision of something returning to a craft it had abandoned only temporarily. And as the last lantern dimmed to a trembling filament of gold, the underground seemed to draw a single, steady breath, as though resuming work that had never truly paused, merely waited for new materials to arrive. The final truth rose from the silence like a blade lifted from water, emerging with a clarity that felt both sudden and long prepared, as though the underground had been waiting centuries for the exact moment to reveal its intention. The chamber that only moments earlier had been cluttered with scattered mannequins and dormant tools now stood transformed. Along the curved walls, the wooden figures no longer leaned where they had been discovered. They stood at the edge of the corridor in a deliberate semicircle, their bodies aligned with a precision too exact for chance. Each faceless head tilted with the same unnatural angle, unified in an eerie gesture of attention directed solely toward the restorers. Their torsos reflected the dim light with a sheen that suggested recent handling, as though the wood had been warmed by unseen palms guiding them into place. The air pressed inward, thickening until breathing felt like swallowing warm sap. The restorers stepped backward, though the chamber seemed to tighten around them, narrowing their retreat with a cruelty disguised in stillness. Then, from deep within the semicircle, beneath the ribs of one of the wooden forms, something shifted. At first it was nothing more than a subtle ripple, a movement beneath the surface that might have been dismissed as settling grain. But the ripple grew, bulging outward with deliberate persistence, pressing against the wood from within. The shape wriggled with a grotesque determination, pushing against the rigid ribcage until the wood creaked in a strained protest, as though bones rather than timber resisted the intrusion. For a moment the motion paused, then resumed with renewed strength, and the restorers realized with horror that something inside the mannequin was seeking release. Their attention snapped toward the workbench at the center of the room, where the unfinished wax face lay. Its features, once crude and unfamiliar, began to shift with a motion that defied the rules of cooling wax. The surface did not melt downward. Instead it drew inward, collecting itself as though inhaling. The cheeks rounded, the brow tightened, the jawline sharpened with slow, inevitable precision. The face was not losing form, it was gaining it. The wax gathered into the likeness of the last person who had dared to step into the chamber, the youngest of the restorers, whose trembling breath now echoed faintly in the smothered air. The waxen eyelids pressed outward from beneath, as though something behind them sought to break through and gaze upon its creator. Each feature aligned with a dreadful accuracy, sculpted by a hand the restorers could not see, yet whose presence pulsed in the humming stone overhead. The humming deepened, no longer the nervous vibration of a dormant chamber, but the steady cadence of a craftsman reawakening to his trade. It reverberated through the domed ceiling, down the walls, and into the floor with the certainty of ritual. The mannequins responded, their wooden frames tightening as though braced for instruction. The scratching sound returned, not from behind but from everywhere at once, threading through the air with a coarse insistence, the unmistakable rhythm of a blade meeting layers of soft resistance. The restorers fled, stumbling through the corridor that moments earlier had guided them like a living artery. Now it constricted behind them, the walls drawing closer as though attempting to reclaim what had escaped. They reached the base of the staircase only to freeze in bewildered despair. Where the first steps should have risen toward the world above, a smooth wall of fresh, pale wood blocked their path. It bore no seams, no hinges, no marks of construction, only a faint warmth beneath its surface, as though the wood had not yet cooled from the shaping of invisible hands. When one restorer pressed a palm against it, the surface yielded slightly, warm and pliant, like living skin stretched taut over bone. The chamber behind them vibrated with the escalating hum of work resumed. The mannequins' silent procession drew nearer, their jointed frames whispering across the floor with each incremental shift. The scent of heated resin thickened, mingling with something older and metallic that stirred beneath it, awakening from long dormancy. The restorers struck the new wooden barrier with fists, tools, anything they could grasp, but the surface absorbed each blow with a soft elasticity that denied any hope of escape. Already the humming behind them had found a new rhythm, steady, confident, the rhythm of a hand reacquainted with its materials. And as the underground pulsed with its resurgent craft, as the unseen sculptor resumed the work history believed extinguished, the city above remained unaware that the terror had never truly ended. It had merely shed its guillotines and tormented daylight for the quiet patience of subterranean chambers, where ideals were still being carved, now not from citizens, but from those who dared disturb the remnants of its perfection.